What you are about to hear is not the kind of story that gets told often, because the people who have the power to tell it are usually the same people who benefit from it never being told. But on a Wednesday afternoon in February 2025, in a television studio in Los Angeles, something happened that cracked open a door that a lot of very powerful, very wealthy people would have preferred stayed shut. And once that door opened, it did not close again. Not for the man who walked through it. Not for the man who kicked him out. And certainly not for the 43-year-old warehouse worker who stood on that stage, and without meaning to, without planning it, without any idea of the magnitude of what was about to happen, told the truth about how this country treats the people who keep it running. Before we dive into this story of power, disrespect, and the moment Steve Harvey drew a line that no amount of money could cross, hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. Because what happened next is not just a family feud moment. It is a mirror held up to a system that has been broken for a long time, and nobody with the platform to do anything about it has ever been brave enough to hold it up. Until now. The Family Feud studio that afternoon looked exactly the way it always does. Bright lights, polished floors, the audience settling into their seats with the comfortable anticipation of people who have come to enjoy something light and entertaining. Two families were set to compete, and on paper, the matchup was designed to be interesting. On one side stood what the producers had billed as the Henderson family, a group of five that included Daniel Henderson himself, 51 years old, CEO of Henderson Logistics, one of the largest freight and distribution companies in the country. A man whose name appeared on Forbes lists and whose face showed up in business magazines with the regularity of someone who had a very good publicist and a very clear understanding of how image worked. Henderson was not just wealthy. He was the kind of wealthy that had become almost abstract, the kind of number that does not mean anything in the context of ordinary human life. His company moved billions of dollars worth of goods every year. He employed over 12,000 people across the country. He had been profiled in the New York Times. He had given a TED Talk about leadership that had been viewed 11 million times. He was, by every conventional measure, a success story. The American dream made flesh and pressed into a tailored suit. Standing beside Henderson on stage were four people who, to anyone paying attention, did not look like family at all. There was Marcus Webb, 31, lean and quiet, with calloused hands and the slightly hunched posture of someone who spent 10 hours a day bending over conveyor belts. There was Denise Carter, 45, with tired eyes and a smile that she deployed quickly and strategically, the smile of someone who had learned that being pleasant kept the peace and kept you employed. There was Roy Gutierrez, 58, broad and weathered, with the kind of permanent ache in his shoulders that comes from decades of physical labor. And there was Tanya Brooks, 28, the youngest of the group, with sharp eyes and a stillness about her that suggested she was paying very close attention to everything happening around her. They were not Henderson's family. They were his employees. Warehouse workers, all of them, from the Henderson Logistics Distribution Center outside of Atlanta. The producers had pitched the episode as a fun twist, the boss playing alongside his workers, a celebration of the team that kept the company running. Henderson had agreed enthusiastically. It was good publicity. It humanized him. It showed the public that he was not just some faceless billionaire but a man who valued the people who worked for him, who saw them as part of his family. That was the narrative. That was what the cameras were supposed to capture. On the other side of the stage stood an actual family, the Rodriguezes from Miami, a multi-generational group that radiated the kind of warmth and chaos that made great television. They were loud and funny, and completely uninterested in anything except having a good time, and they provided the perfect counterbalance to the quiet tension that was building, unnoticed by most, on the Henderson side of the stage. Steve Harvey entered with his usual energy, working the room, getting laughs, settling into the rhythm of the show. He approached Henderson first, because Henderson was the centerpiece of the episode, the celebrity guest, the draw. Steve shook his hand with genuine enthusiasm. Daniel Henderson, the man, the myth, the legend, welcome to Family Feud. Henderson smiled the way men like Henderson smile, confident and practiced, and just slightly condescending, the smile of someone who was used to being the most important person in every room he entered. Thank you, Steve, glad to be here. And I have to tell you, I am looking forward to showing America what a real team looks like. He gestured to his four employees behind him, and the gesture itself told you everything you needed to know about Daniel Henderson. It was the gesture of a man presenting his possessions, His car, his house, his workers. Steve caught it. He did not react to it, not yet, but he caught it the way a man who has spent decades reading people catches the things that other people miss. Steve moved down the line, asking each person about themselves. Marcus said he had been with Henderson Logistics for 4 years, working the loading dock. Denise said she had been there for 7 years, running inventory. Roy said he had been there for 11 years, the longest tenure on their shift. Tanya said she had been there for 2 years and that she was grateful for the job. That last part, grateful for the job, landed in a way that Steve noticed but did not pursue. Not yet. There was something in the way Tanya said it, something practiced and careful, like a line she had been trained to deliver. Steve filed it away and moved on. The game started normally. Survey questions, shouted answers, the Rodriguezes celebrating every point with theatrical abandon. Henderson played loudly and confidently, answering questions before his teammates could even open their mouths, laughing at his own jokes, turning to the camera with the self-satisfied expression of a man who was enjoying being watched. His teammates played quietly. They deferred to him constantly. When Henderson got an answer wrong, they said nothing. When he got one right, they cheered, but the cheering had a quality to it that was less celebration and more obligation, the way you clap for your boss at the company Christmas party because not clapping would be noticed. The first round went to the Rodriguezes. Henderson took the loss with visible displeasure, his jaw tightening, his smile becoming sharper at the edges. He turned to his teammates and said, loud enough for the microphones to pick up, "Come on, people. I did not bring you all the way to Los Angeles to embarrass me on national television." The words landed differently than Henderson intended them to. He meant them as a joke, or at least he meant for them to be received as a joke. But in the studio, in the ears of 4 people who spent their days working under this man, in the context of a relationship that the audience did not yet fully understand, the words carried weight. Marcus shifted uncomfortably. Denise's smile tightened. Roy looked at the floor. Tanya at the end of the line went very still. Steve Harvey noticed, he always noticed. Hold on now, he said, his tone light but his eyes sharp. This is supposed to be fun, Daniel, we are just playing a game. Henderson waved his hand dismissively. Of course, I am just kidding around. Right, team? He looked at his employees, and they all nodded quickly, laughing nervously, the way people laugh when they are not sure if they are allowed to stop laughing. The second round began. The question on the board read, things a boss does that makes employees want to quit. It was a survey question designed to be funny, the kind of relatable workplace humor that audiences loved. The Rodriguezes went first and gave answers that got big laughs, things about micromanagers and passive-aggressive emails and stealing lunches from the break room fridge. Then it was the Henderson team's turn, and Steve turned to Roy Gutierrez, the oldest member of the group, the man who had worked for Henderson Logistics for 11 years. Roy, you have been working for this company for over a decade. You must have some good ones. What does your boss do that makes people want to quit? Roy glanced at Henderson. It was a quick glance, barely a flicker of the eyes, but it carried an entire conversation. It was the glance of a man who was being asked to say something true in front of the person that truth was about, and who was calculating in real time whether the truth was worth the risk. Roy laughed nervously and said, "Oh, I do not know, maybe when he does not remember my birthday." It was a safe answer, a harmless answer. The kind of answer that kept everything on the surface and kept Roy employed on Monday morning. The audience laughed. Henderson laughed. Steve nodded and checked the survey board. It was not one of the top answers. Steve moved down the line. Denise, how about you? What does a boss do that makes people want to quit? Denise gave another safe answer about too many meetings. Also not a top answer. Henderson's expression was shifting now, the easy confidence giving way to something sharper, something impatient. He was not used to his team underperforming. He was not used to not winning. Then Steve turned to Marcus Webb, the 31-year-old who had been standing quietly at the end of the line the entire game, barely speaking, watching everything with the kind of focused attention that suggested he was holding something back. Marcus, you have been with the company for 4 years. What does your boss do that makes workers want to quit? And here is where the story changes. Here is where everything that had been building beneath the surface, the tension and the deference and the careful practice smiles, all of it cracked open. Marcus Webb looked at Daniel Henderson. He did not glance. He did not flicker. He looked directly and deliberately at the man who signed his paycheck, the man who owned the building where he spent 10 hours a day, the man who had the power to end his livelihood with a single phone call. And then Marcus Webb told the truth. When they do not pay us what we are worth, Marcus said. His voice was quiet, but the microphone carried it perfectly. When they make us work 12-hour shifts with only one 30-minute break. When they tell us we are family but they would not recognize us if they passed us on the street. The studio went silent, not the dramatic silence of a shocking reveal. The deeper silence that comes when something true has been said in a room full of people who were not expecting it, and everyone is suddenly recalculating what they are actually watching. Henderson's face did something complicated. The practiced smile flickered. His jaw set. Something moved behind his eyes that was not quite anger and not quite fear, but was somewhere in the territory between the two. The expression of a man who had just been publicly contradicted by someone he considered beneath him. Steve Harvey held up his hand, not to stop Marcus but to hold the moment to let it breathe. He looked at the survey board. He looked back at Marcus. And then he looked at the board again because Marcus's answer, the truth that Marcus had just spoken on national television, was the #1 survey response. That is the #1 answer, Steve said, and his voice was different now. Quieter, more serious. The entertainer was receding and something else was emerging. The man underneath the entertainer. The man who had grown up poor and had worked for everything he had, and who understood, in a way that Daniel Henderson could never understand, what it meant to be the person at the bottom of someone else's empire. Henderson stepped forward. His body language had shifted completely. The relaxed confidence was gone, replaced by something rigid and defensive. Steve, I think we need to move on. This is supposed to be a game show, not a therapy session. Marcus, you and I will talk about this later. The way he said, we will talk about this later, carried a threat so clear that every person in that studio heard it. It was not a statement of concern or a promise of conversation. It was a warning, a reminder of the power dynamic that existed between them the moment the cameras stopped rolling. And that is when Steve Harvey did something that nobody expected. He stepped directly in front of Henderson, not aggressively, not confrontationally, but firmly the way a man steps in front of a door to make sure it stays open. Hold on, Steve said, and his voice carried an authority that had nothing to do with his fame or his wealth or his television platform. It was the authority of a man who had been where Marcus Webb was standing, who had been the person at the bottom, who had been told to be grateful and to shut up and to not make waves. Hold on, Daniel. You just threatened that young man on national television. Did you hear yourself? Did you hear what you just said to him? Henderson's expression hardened. I did not threaten anyone. I said we would talk later. That is what leaders do. They address issues privately. No, Steve said, and the single word carried more weight than a paragraph. No. What leaders do is not threaten their employees on live television when those employees tell the truth. What you just did, right there, in front of this audience and every person watching at home, was show everyone exactly who you are. You just showed them exactly why Marcus said what he said. The studio was holding its breath. The Rodriguezes on the other side of the stage had gone completely still. The audience was leaning forward in their seats. The camera operators had instinctively zoomed in on Henderson's face, because every person in that room understood that they were watching something that mattered. Henderson tried to recover. He laughed, that practiced laugh, the one that was designed to make disagreement seem unreasonable. Steve, come on, we are having fun here. This is a game show. Nobody is threatening anybody. I think you are blowing this out of proportion. Steve Harvey did not laugh back. He did not smile. He stood exactly where he was and he looked at Daniel Henderson with an expression that was calm and clear and completely unmovable. Daniel, I have been doing this show for a long time. I have had all kinds of people on this stage. Rich people, poor people, famous people, people nobody has ever heard of, and in all that time I have never once seen a man threaten one of his own workers for telling the truth on my show. Not once, and I am not going to let it happen today. He paused, and when he spoke again, every word was deliberate and precise. I am going to ask you to leave the stage. The words landed like something physical. Henderson's face went through a rapid sequence of emotions, disbelief, then indignation, then something that looked very briefly like fear before it was replaced by fury. You are kidding me, Henderson said. You are actually kicking me out of your show. Do you know who I am? Do you know what my company does? I have 12,000 employees. I have lawyers, Steve, I have. I do not care, Steve Harvey said. And the simplicity of those 3 words, spoken with absolute calm, cut through everything Henderson was trying to build. I do not care who you are. I do not care how many employees you have. I do not care about your lawyers. What I care about is what just happened on this stage. A man told the truth about how you treat the people who work for you, and your first response was to threaten him. That tells me everything I need to know about you. And I will not have that kind of behavior on my show. Steve turned to the producers and nodded once. The message was clear and it was final. Henderson stood there for a long moment, his face cycling through rage and humiliation, and the dawning realization that this moment was being captured on camera and that no amount of money or influence was going to erase it. Then Henderson turned and walked off the stage. He did not say goodbye. He did not shake hands. He walked off with the rigid, furious stride of a man who was already calculating how to control the damage, and the door closed behind him, and the studio let out a collective breath that felt like it had been held for hours. What happened next is where this story becomes something larger than a game show moment. Steve Harvey turned back to the four workers who were still standing on the stage, and his entire demeanor changed. The confrontation with Henderson was over. What was beginning was something else entirely. Okay, Steve said, pulling chairs onto the stage. Nobody is going anywhere. We are going to sit down and we are going to talk about this, because what just happened here is important, and I think the people watching deserve to understand what is really going on. Marcus, Roy, Denise, and Tanya sat down. Steve sat with them, close, like a man having a conversation with people he genuinely wanted to hear. And for the next hour, on what was supposed to be a light-hearted game show, four warehouse workers told the truth about what it was like to work for Daniel Henderson, about what it was like to work for companies like Daniel Henderson's. Marcus talked about the shifts: 12 hours on, 8 hours off, 4 days a week, with mandatory overtime during the holiday season that could push the hours even higher. He talked about the break room with the broken air conditioning that had been reported 6 times and never fixed. He talked about the injury rates, about coworkers who had been hurt on the job and were quietly pressured to file workers' compensation claims that would not actually cover what happened to them. Denise talked about the wages, about making $14 an hour after 7 years of working for a company that generated billions in revenue, about the benefits that sounded good on paper but had so many restrictions and exclusions that they barely covered anything when you actually needed them, about the way the company celebrated Employee Appreciation Week with a pizza party and a gift card while the CEO's annual bonus could have funded every worker's salary for a year. Roy talked about the culture, about being told, constantly, that they were a family, that Henderson cared about them, that the company was more than just a job. About how that language was used, deliberately and strategically, to make workers feel guilty about asking for better conditions. If we are a family, the implication went, then you would not complain. You would not unionize. You would not make waves. You would be grateful. And Tanya talked about what happened when workers spoke up, about the coworker who had filed a complaint about unsafe working conditions and had been let go 3 weeks later for performance issues, about the woman who had asked about maternity leave and been told, off the record, that it was probably best if she looked for opportunities elsewhere, about the quiet, systematic way that anyone who questioned the system was made to feel unwelcome until they left on their own, so that the company never had to fire anyone and never had to admit that they were silencing the people who worked for them. Steve Harvey listened to all of it. He asked questions. He leaned forward. He nodded. And when they finished, when the four workers had said everything they needed to say, he turned to the camera and he spoke directly to the millions of people who were going to watch this episode. What you just heard is not unusual, Steve said. What you just heard is not one bad company or one bad CEO. What you just heard is the way this system works. We have built an economy in this country where the people who do the hardest work, the people who lift the boxes and drive the trucks and run the warehouses and keep everything moving, are the people who get paid the least and respected the least and heard the least. And the people who run the companies, the people who take the credit and collect the profits and get the magazine covers, they are the ones who get to tell the story. They get to decide what the narrative is. They get to decide who the heroes are. And the workers, the people who actually make it all run, they get to say thank you and be grateful and keep their mouths shut. He paused, and his voice carried something that went beyond entertainment, beyond even passion. It carried the weight of personal experience, of a man who had lived on the other side of that divide and who understood in his bones what it cost. Daniel Henderson walked off this stage today because he could not handle the truth being told about him in public. He could not handle one of his own workers looking him in the eye and saying this is not right. And that tells you everything you need to know about where the real power is in this country. It is not with the people who have the money. It is not with the people who have the titles. It is with the people who have the courage to speak the truth, even when speaking the truth puts everything they have at risk. The episode aired 2 weeks later, and what happened after it aired was not the kind of thing that happens when a game show does a lighthearted segment about workplace dynamics. What happened was a reckoning. The clip of Steve Harvey kicking Daniel Henderson off the stage spread across every platform within hours. Not because it was funny, though there was something satisfying about watching a man with billions of dollars being told to leave a television studio by a man with a microphone. It spread because it was true. Because Marcus's words, spoken quietly and without drama on a Wednesday afternoon, had touched something that millions of people recognized. The experience of being told you are valued while being treated like you are disposable. The experience of being called family by a company that would replace you without a second thought. The experience of having the truth you knew, the truth you lived every single day, dismissed and silenced, and made to feel like something to be ashamed of. The Henderson logistics story broke open in the days that followed. Journalists started investigating. Workers from other distribution centers came forward with their own accounts. Labor rights organizations filed complaints. A congressional subcommittee opened an inquiry into working conditions in the freight and logistics industry, and Daniel Henderson's name was in the first paragraph of the briefing document. Henderson's publicist released a statement calling the Family Feud appearance a misunderstanding, saying that Henderson had been taken out of context, that the company was committed to its workers, and had robust policies in place to ensure fair treatment. The statement was careful and measured, and said absolutely nothing. It was the kind of statement that is designed to look like a response, while actually being a way of saying nothing at all. Within a month, 3 class action lawsuits had been filed against Henderson Logistics on behalf of warehouse workers across 6 states. The lawsuits alleged wage theft, unsafe working conditions, and a pattern of retaliation against employees who raised concerns. The evidence, once lawyers started looking, was overwhelming. Internal emails showed that management had been aware of safety violations for months before they were corrected. Pay records showed systematic underpayment during overtime periods. HR files showed a pattern of terminations that followed closely on the heels of workers filing complaints. Daniel Henderson hired a team of lawyers that cost more per hour than his warehouse workers made in a week. He did not appear on television again. He did not give interviews. He retreated into the fortress of wealth and legal counsel that men like him retreat into when the world outside becomes uncomfortable. But the world outside was not going to let him disappear. Not this time. Marcus Webb became a focal point of the labor movement that emerged in the wake of the episode. He did not seek the attention. He was not a natural public speaker. He was a quiet man who had spent his adult life lifting boxes and keeping his head down and surviving. But something had shifted in him on that stage, something fundamental and irreversible. He had spoken the truth in front of millions of people, and the sky had not fallen. The world had not ended. If anything, the world had responded by saying yes. We know. We see it too. You are not alone. Marcus joined a labor organizing effort at Henderson Logistics and helped lead a campaign for better wages, safer conditions, and the right to collective bargaining without retaliation. The campaign took months of quiet, unglamorous work, of conversations in break rooms and parking lots, of building trust person by person, shift by shift. But it worked. Henderson Logistics negotiated a new contract with its workers that included a wage increase, improved benefits, and protections against retaliation for workers who raised safety concerns. Roy Gutierrez, the 58-year-old who had worked for the company for 11 years, became an unlikely spokesperson for worker safety. He started speaking at labor conferences and community meetings, telling his story with the directness of a man who had spent decades staying quiet and had finally found his voice. He talked about the injuries he had seen, the friends who had been hurt, the way the company had made workers feel responsible for their own safety while providing inadequate protection. His testimony before the congressional subcommittee was one of the most powerful statements made during the hearings. Denise Carter used her platform to advocate for wage transparency and fair compensation. She started a blog about working conditions in the logistics industry that became one of the most read resources for warehouse workers across the country. She wrote about the gap between what companies said they valued and what they actually paid, between the rhetoric of family and community and the reality of poverty wages and broken promises. And Tanya Brooks, the youngest of the four, the one who had been quiet and watchful throughout the episode, became a labor attorney. She had been studying for the bar exam when the Family Feud episode aired, had been working at Henderson Logistics to pay for her education while she finished her degree. The experience on that stage did not change her career path. It confirmed it. She had always known that the system was broken. Now she had seen, on national television, what it looked like when someone tried to fix it, and what it looked like when power tried to shut that fixing down. Steve Harvey followed up on the story personally. He invited Marcus, Roy, Denise, and Tanya back for a special segment 6 months after the original episode aired. They sat on the stage together, the same four people who had told the truth on a Wednesday afternoon, and they talked about what had changed, and what had not changed, and what still needed to change. Marcus talked about the new contract, and how it had improved things, but how there was still so much work to do. One contract at one company does not fix the system, he said. But it proves that the system can be fixed. It proves that when workers speak up together, when they are brave enough to tell the truth, things can change. Not overnight, not easily, but they can change. Roy talked about the congressional hearings and how they had led to new regulations that applied not just to Henderson Logistics but to the entire freight and logistics industry. They asked me in Washington what I wanted, Roy said. And I told them. I wanted them to treat the people who do the work the same way they treat the people who profit from the work. That is all. I am not asking for anything complicated. I am asking for basic dignity. Denise talked about the conversations she had been having with other workers across the country who had seen the episode and reached out to her. So many people are living exactly what we described, she said. They are working full-time and they cannot pay their rent. They are working in conditions that are not safe, and they are afraid to say anything because they know what will happen if they do. The episode did not change that overnight, but it made them feel like they were not alone. And sometimes that is the first step. Tanya talked about the lawsuits and where they stood. 3 cases had settled, 2 were still pending. The settlements had resulted in back pay for hundreds of workers and structural changes to how Henderson Logistics operated. But here is what people need to understand, Tanya said, her voice carrying the precision of someone who was already thinking like a lawyer. This is not just about Henderson Logistics. The same patterns exist at companies across this country. The same wage theft. The same unsafe conditions. The same retaliation against workers who speak up. Henderson just happened to be the one who got caught on camera. There are thousands of Daniel Hendersons who have not been caught yet. Steve Harvey, listening to all of this, nodded slowly. Then he turned to the camera one final time and said something that became one of the most quoted moments from the entire saga. Daniel Henderson walked off this stage because he did not want to be seen. He did not want the people watching to understand what was happening inside his company. Because once people understand, once they really see how the system works, and who it works for and who it hurts, they start asking questions. And questions are the one thing that people like Daniel Henderson are most afraid of. Not lawsuits, not regulations, not bad publicity. Questions, because questions lead to answers, and answers lead to change. 10 years after that Wednesday afternoon in the Family Feud studio, the landscape of worker rights in the freight and logistics industry looked fundamentally different. New federal regulations had raised the floor on wages and safety standards. Collective bargaining protections had been strengthened. Worker advocacy organizations had grown from small grassroots groups into powerful forces that had genuine influence on policy. Daniel Henderson had largely disappeared from public life. His company had been restructured after the lawsuits, its leadership changed, its practices overhauled. Henderson himself had settled quietly and privately, paying out tens of millions in damages without ever admitting wrongdoing, the way men with his resources always settle, with money and silence, and the hope that the world would eventually forget. But the world did not forget. Not the 4 workers who had told the truth on a Wednesday afternoon. Not Marcus, who had become a labor organizer and a father who taught his children that speaking up was not just a right but a responsibility. Not Roy, who had become a beloved figure in the worker advocacy community and who still spoke at conferences well into his 70s. Not Denise, whose blog had turned into a book that was taught in labor studies courses at universities across the country. And not Tanya, who had become one of the most effective labor attorneys in the country, who had built a practice dedicated to the people that the system was designed to ignore. And the moment itself, Steve Harvey standing between a billionaire and the truth, and saying not on my stage, that moment had become something larger than any of them had imagined when it happened. It had become a symbol, a proof of concept, evidence that power could be checked, not by money or lawyers or public relations teams, but by the simple, radical, revolutionary act of telling the truth in a room where the truth was not welcome. If you have been moved by this story of courage, accountability, and the workers who refuse to stay silent, please like this video and subscribe to our channel. Share this with someone who has ever been told to be grateful for a job that does not pay them what they deserve. Share this with someone who has ever been silenced for speaking the truth about how they are treated. Remember that Daniel Henderson was not an outlier. He was a symptom. Remember that Marcus Webb was not exceptional. He was ordinary, which is exactly what made him extraordinary, because it proved that anyone, any worker, any person who has been told to keep their head down and stay quiet, has the power to change things simply by refusing to look away. The system is not broken because nobody knows it is broken. The system is broken because the people who benefit from it being broken have convinced the rest of us that it is working the way it is supposed to work. Marcus Webb walked onto a game show and told the truth. And the truth, once it is out there, once it is in the air, once millions of people have heard it and recognized it as their own experience, the truth cannot be kicked off the stage. It cannot be threatened. It cannot be silenced. It can only be faced.